What I want to talk about today is some work we've been doing on punishment in the laboratory and share it with you because I think when I was invited to come, I thought one thing that I might have that would be useful are data about people's instincts for punishing on their own behalf, on the behalf of their friends, and on behalf of strangers in a way that might be sort of new and perhaps slightly at variance with the kinds of data we usually marshal when we want to think about what humans' propensities are in this realm. So one of the methodological things that really interests me is, I guess sort of on a philosophical level, is what sorts of characteristics should events that we make happen in a laboratory have? What are the key dimensions or qualities they should have when we want to generalize from observations we might make in the laboratory to things that are going on in the real world? So if this is us up here, beavering away in our labs, and what we want to do is make observations in the laboratory that might be relevant to this or to this, what do we want to have happen in the laboratory that would give us something that we could use, observations that we might use to find purchase on these problems? So as I talk today about that, I've got this in mind, thinking about the characteristics of studies that we might want to privilege when we think about this. At the very least, include when we think about punishment and warfare. Punishment turns out to have an interesting place in recent evolutionary thinking about warfare. You can find papers from 2006, 2007, 2009, Sarah Matthews and Rob Boyd's important paper in PNAS on punishment in Turkana societies, all invoking the notion of parochial altruism. And parochial altruism is actually not explained perfectly consistently through all of the people who use the idea, but it has something like this at its core. Altruistic norm compliance and norm enforcement that favors the members of one's ethnic, racial, or language group. That's probably a good summary of everything else you see up there as ways of describing this. But the gist of it is that we've got people within our groups who we are prone to cooperate with at a cost to ourselves, and also to punish at a cost to ourselves in order to keep them in line, discipline them, keep them contributing to public goods. And some of those public goods we're going to generate are designed to help us to attack other groups when we're fighting with them. So obviously the notion of punishment is important in parochial altruism. And the ways that data are sort of marshaled and used, I think quite forgivably is used in different ways, not altogether consistent across the different ways people talk about the concept. Some people talk about the parochial altruism concept is giving you the prediction that you're going to be increasingly willing to punish norm violators within your social group. Others predict that you're willing to punish anybody, either in your group or outside of your group, who is bad to someone within your social group. And even in the original formulation of the idea, Fair and his colleagues invoked the idea that generalized punishment that we might see in laboratory designs would be something we would want to consider seriously as evidence for this parochial altruism. So where do we get our data about people's appetites for punishing? Largely they come from two kinds of experiments. They come from the classic Fair-Gachter experiments that Joanna talked about yesterday, where we give people an endowment for punishing selfish individuals in their groups. And you get a sense from the data in those kinds of public goods games experiments with punishment that people really don't like to see stingy people in their public goods groups, and the higher those stingy people's deviations from the average contributions to the public good, the more willing people are to step up and punish. So that's one sort of, those are data that we might nominate as sort of candidates for giving us numbers that we'd want our models to return, right? You'd want your models for the evolution of warlike instincts to return data like these, okay? You can see a very similar kind of pattern in the work that Fair and Fischbacher did in a slightly different game called the third-party punishment game. And in the third-party punishment game, actually, let me just show you how it works. Let me show you what you find, and let me show you how it works. There's a dictator. The dictator has an endowment of money and can give it to another person as much, as little as he or she would like. And third parties are sitting on the edge asking to describe what they would do if the dictator were to give no money, some money, a little money, half the money, and to tell how much punishment they would be willing to commit to imposing in advance at a cost to themselves. So the third-party punishment game, again, works like this. There's a dictator with $10. He or she shares some money, $0 to $5, let's say, up to some norm of 50-50 fairness. And then a witness can watch this and then pay to punish. The punishment decisions are made in advance, okay? So you as the, pardon me, why is this going forward? We got to stop that. So let's see, where was I? One of the things that's going on with the witness here is that he or she is asked to commit to punishing in advance of actually knowing what happened. So these are what we call strategy method responses. You're given the range of things that the bad guy that the dictator could do, and you step up and say, how much, I would be willing to give this much money to punish him or her, given that he's going to be very stingy or very generous and so forth. So there might be some issues with this method, and I said I'm interested in thinking about the concepts here behind the designs we use. One of the things about particularly that third-party punishment game is that the norm violation is actually kind of weak, and it conflicts with another norm, right? So the norm, even in the third-party punishment game or even in the public goods game, those are norms about sharing or contributing to a public good, which actually are conflicting with property rights. So there's reasons to think that people are actually in a norm conflict when they're playing these games. So one thing you might do, and that I wanted to do to try to maximize norm violation, is to violate property rights, or as you'll see in a bit, really try to injure people's sort of honor to see if we can get more sort of unequivocal norm violations or harms, to really ramp up sort of the level of outrage. A second issue that these experiments often have is something we social psychologists call experimental demand. Demand is basically the ability of a subject to discover what it is that the researcher is interested in studying by the structure of the behavioral responses at the subject's disposal. So if you're in a game where you are being asked to give your punishment decisions, to commit to certain courses of action in advance, and you're being asked how much you would punish if the dictator gives nothing to the recipient, gives $1 to the recipient, $2, $3, and so forth. It's fairly easy to see that what the experimenter is interested in is punishment, and you, as an intelligent person, are going to realize that to some extent, the researcher wants you to respond to the only thing that's varying across these different measurements, which is the amount of harm. So there's high demand here for punishment. So we want to try to find corrections for that as well. Another problem, finally, and we're going to attack that problem by allowing participants to either give or take from the dictator. We're also going to use between subjects manipulations rather than within subjects manipulations. The final problem that something like that third-party punishment game also has is a problem called affective forecasting. This is a well-known problem in psychology that people are only really beginning to grapple with, although the phenomena has been known for 40 years. When you ask someone to imagine what they would do or to simulate what they think they would do in real life, the truth is that they typically have very little access to the information processing systems that generate that behavior in real time. They just don't have access. The psychologist Tim Wilson calls this saying more than we can know. So this is a problem that we've wanted to try to distance ourselves from by developing designs in which affective forecasting isn't possible. You're presented with a situation in the laboratory, and then you have to respond to it intuitively rather than on the basis of what you think the study might be about or how you think you might behave in the future if the situation were actually about to happen. So I'm going to tell you about 3 experiments today, and the first is an attempt to study third-party punishment using a modified game. In this game, we really try to make the harm unequivocal and make it a norm violation by having dictators not fail to give from their own endowments, but actually steal from another player's endowment. So this is what you might call a lot of people call a reverse dictator game or a taking game. We're going to also modify it by giving witnesses of these harms or recipients of these harms the opportunity not only to impose punishment on the bad guy, but also to reward the bad guy or to do nothing. So by extending the decision space, our hope is to avoid experimental demand as much as possible. So what do we find when we do this? Here's the game. You're either a witness of a harm or a recipient of a harm. Everybody starts off with $5. And then, so one independent variable is whether you're receiving the harm or just watching it happen. And then the second independent variable is whether the dictator takes nothing from the recipient, which could be you, or takes $4 from the recipient, which could be you. So fair, unfair behavior from the dictator, you're either watching it or seeing it happen. And then the witness can pay to punish. It's not called punishment. It's just a second game where the subject is asked whether hey, would you like to, here's a second game. And the person who happened to be the dictator in the first game is now the recipient in this game. You have the option of sending them some money, or you have the option of taking some money or doing nothing. The full decision space. So what do we find? In these four conditions, fair witnesses of harm, fair recipients of harm, recipients of fairness, witnesses of fairness, recipients of unfairness, witnesses of unfairness. The only distribution where we see anybody imposing costs significantly different from zero is the recipients of unfairness. They're the only ones we see doing any impositions of costs. None of those other distributions are significantly different from zero. What about the psychological or affective experience of these games for participants? We generally think of emotion as a signal that something adaptively significant is happening, and you've noticed it. Who gets angry at the dictator in these games? Do bystanders, witnesses of unfairness, get angry in comparison to other groups? Which is the prediction you'd make if you think the third-party punishment game data from Farron Fishbacher, is really giving us a window into people's intuitions. You'd expect witnesses of unfairness to get angry, and they really don't. The only group of people who are significantly different from any others in self-reported anger, once we've controlled for envy, which doesn't matter, but it's worth doing, is recipients of unfairness. So there's a signal here that they were, in fact, feeling personally involved in this, and that their decision to punish was at least motivated out of some recognition that there's something adaptively important happening here for them. Here's what's really mind-blowing to us about this, is that witnesses and recipients of harm, of fairness and unfairness, have identical judgments of the morality and the fairness of what's just taken place. So if you're the witness just watching this fair behavior or unfair behavior happen, it's not like your moral sensibilities are impaired. You can see that the behavior was unfair. You can see that the behavior was wrong. So it's not like perceptions are being violated here. They're seeing exactly what the involved victims of the unfairness are seeing. It's just that for some reason they're not getting angry about it and not punishing above zero. Okay, so I'll move quickly through some attempts we've made, sort of sub-experiments, to see if we can get more anger and more punishment by jacking up affective forecasting and jacking up the demand. So let's do some experiments where we just ask people hypothetically what they think they would do if they were the witness or the recipient in a dictator game where the dictator was going to be fair or unfair. Thanks. Okay. So what we see there in these hypothetical experiments, here we are in the real experiment where behavior's happening in real time and people are just responding to the bloomin' buzzin' confusion around them. Recipients of harm punish. No one else does. In experiment 2A, hypothetical, we see witnesses of harm indicating that they'd punish in 2 experiments, as well as the recipients of harm. So when you really jack up the demand and jack up the affective forecasting, it's really clear people are walking around with implicit theories that tell them that they're going to step in and punish when they see a bad guy mistreat a third party. Same thing with when you ask them what their punishment would look like. These guys actually were treated unfairly. These are people who were treated, who only were asked to sort of simulate how they think they might respond, okay? So that's a first set of games with the dictator game in which we're trying to really ask critically what we should make of people's intuitions about punishment and whether they really will step up and defend the victim of a bad guy. 2 more experiments with different kinds of harms and different kinds of punishments. This is classic social psychology. We bring people into the laboratory and they interact with strangers. In a second experiment, I'll talk about you've brought in a friend with you. Each person in this 4-person group writes an essay on a personally important topic. All the essays are written on a computer and switched around. By the way, I should indicate these are deception experiments. There aren't other subjects involved. But the essays are real. They're written by people from my laboratory. And so you're reading essays ostensibly written by other people. If it's your friend, you did read your own friend's essay. Then you're supposed to write up feedback on these essays, grade them on sort of literary quality, just give a little review. And there's some staged feedback that you read that's an insult. An insulter writes, "I can't believe an educated person would think like this. I hope this person learned something while at UM." You get this feedback, and then you're given the opportunity to impose a punishment, but you don't call it a punishment. We don't call it a punishment. It's a new game, if you like. We say, "Thanks very much for your time in the study today. We'd like to get find out how you're feeling about your experiences today. Oh, and by the way, would you participate in a new experiment with us where we're testing some sound stimulus?" And the sound stimulus is just a noxious noise blast, and you can control the duration and the volume of it. It sounds like this. Oh, it's just noise, right? So, but you can make it very loud in your headphones, and you believe you're delivering this stimulus to one of the other players. So what do we find in terms of the amounts of sound used to blast individuals as a function of whether they harmed you or harmed you or harmed a stranger? So you're going to deliver a blast of sound, not as a weapon. We're asking you to deliver it so that the other party can rate its qualities for a sound experiment we're doing later. But if you're angry and you want to retaliate, you should discover without prompting that this is a weapon and you can use it as a weapon, right? It's never weaponized explicitly. You can discover that it's a weapon. So when people are the victims of this insult, they do discover that the sound blast device is a weapon. And they give more of the sound, longer and louder, than they do to a third party. We can put a region of practical equivalence. This is sort of like a Bayesian t-test. And we find a reasonably sized effect size for it. The fact that there's 0% of the posterior distribution in what's called the rope means that we can be very certain that the amount, that the difference between these two groups is bigger than trivial, okay? Over here as well, insulters, where the victim is a stranger, they do deliver more sound to the insulters than they do to a third party. It's a smaller effect, but the amount in the rope is small. So it does look like in this study we're getting some punishment of the bad guy. Thanks. What about anger? This looks very much like what you see in our third-party punishment study. Very little anger on behalf of the stranger victim, but a lot of anger on behalf of the self. You're angry at that insulter if he or she harmed you. You're not angry at that insulter if he or she harmed an anonymous third party. We can put ropes around those as well and get a sense of whether we should trust these. So there's really not much anger going on there. Final study, you bring in a friend with you, exact same design. Do people punish on their own behalf against that insulter? Yes, absolutely. An effect size of about 0.66, 0% of the posterior distribution in the rope. What about on behalf of your friend? Will you punish if your friend was the victim of the insult? Yes, absolutely. Smaller effect, but 1% of the distribution's in the rope. And then 22% in the rope for the insulter versus the control. No anger going on here, though. Okay, no anger. So let me just move forward and summarize. When do people punish? When the self is injured? Yes, absolutely. When the friend is injured? Yes, absolutely. Anonymous third party? Not so much. In one study, yes. In 2 studies, no. Anger? Self-injured? Yes. Friend injured? Yes. Anonymous third party? No, not in any of the studies. So I want to suggest at least that we consider a plurality of methods for getting these estimates of people's willingness to punish third parties. We've used a lot of data from experimental economics games, and that's fine. Feel free to keep using those. All I want to call for today is perhaps a plurality and perhaps a sort of broad and sort of methodological pluralism in how we think about the reasons we get different kinds of data from different kinds of experiments. Thank you very much.